Meeting your significant other's parents is always a stressful situation, but imagine doing it before every first date. Welcome to dating in the 1950s. A lot of the rules of dating etiquette in the 1950s might seem a bit square today, but they did have the effect of encouraging civility, good manners, and a certain level of mindfulness, which may sound refreshing in an age of absolutely savage digital dating. But then, there are the flat-out sexist rules. The least surprising being that boys were supposed to ask out girls and never the other way around. And it goes without saying that the dating rulebooks of the 1950s did not include any helpful references for queer, non-binary, or trans folks trying to find love. Behind the superficial chivalry of leaving the asking out to the boys is the implication that any girl who would dare ask out a boy is overeager. Which is to say, there was a lot of shaming in these old dating rules, as girls were supposed to be the ones being pursued. A lot of this wasn't explicit. Dating rulebooks instead used coded language about aggressiveness being unattractive. Some things never change, and introducing a special friend to your parents remains a pretty big deal in the 21st century. While the guidelines on when that's appropriate continue to evolve, the fact remains that if you bring someone home, you're basically saying they may be there for the long haul, whatever that means to you. Things were different in the 1950s though. If you were a girl going on a first date with a boy, the boy was expected to pick you up from home and meet your parents for inspection.
Obviously, there's some mistake. A gentleman, Francie, always picks up the young lady.
Well, this gentleman is different.
Well, let him get undifferent fast.
This obviously stems from two fundamentally sexist concepts. One, that a young girl is incapable of judging the character of a boy, and two, that boys have to be approved by the fathers before being granted access to their daughters. It's the same principle that fuels the tradition of fathers giving away brides at weddings, a symbolic transfer of property. Another aspect of this was calling someone. Back in the 1950s, homes typically had just one phone, so chances were if you called up your crush, you'd have to get past their parents first.
And Daddy says if you come around again, he'll knock you into the ground like a tent pole.
But I love you!
Back in the day, even eating a simple meal was fraught with cultural baggage. If you're a woman who knows what you want, you might have struggled a bit in the 1950s dating scene, as the rules required you to tell your date what you wanted and let him order it for you. While this seems like simple sexism, in this case, it was actually more complex. In the 1950s, a date was viewed as a social event, and the man was regarded as the host. In the same way a party host might bring you a drink or a plate of food without asking, the man was expected to take care of everything. Going around your date to order your own meal would have been seen as rude. Today, of course, if a man insists on ordering for his date, he might think it makes him look suave and confident, and some women might find it charming. But usually, it has his date texting 911 to their friends. Another very obvious 1950s attitude toward dating is who paid. The man, of course. In fact, Southern Living magazine noted that men who were happy to let their dates pay for their meals were grafters who had no pride. The Little Things also notes that men would find their date offering to pay for the date emasculating. But the question of splitting the bill or going Dutch isn't so clear-cut. Some dating guides from the 1950s indicate that splitting the bill is perfectly fine as long as both participants agree ahead of time. But some guides expected the man to pay for the whole date and indicated that splitting the bill would have been unthinkable. The times, of course, have changed. A study by a firm notes that 68% of modern daters expect to at least get an offer to split the bill on a first date. According to Reader's Digest, in the 1950s, when a man and a woman walked on the street during a date, the man was expected to walk on the street-facing side at all times. While this might imply that the 1950s were a dangerous decade in which women were routinely snatched off the sidewalks, the reasons behind this antiquated rule aren't quite so negative. According to the Etiquette collection, the practice dates back to pre-automobile days. Walking on the curb side of a street exposed you to splashes from passing carriages, and gentlemen were expected to protect the ladies' fancy clothes by walking on the left side. Another theory is that back in the days when men routinely wore swords, having the lady walking on his left side meant his sheath might get caught up in her dress. This one might not surprise anyone. A big rule of 1950s courtship was no kissing on the first date. Of course, teenagers have been raging hormone machines since the beginning of time, so it seems like this rule was often disregarded. One reason so much of a couple's dating life revolved around the automobile in the 1950s was the privacy and mobility it offered couples. They could drive someplace remote and make out to their heart's content. In his 50s-era dating guidebooks for girls only and for boys only, Frank Howard Richardson used shame to prevent getting busy. He wrote, "I hate to say it, but it's not always the boy who is the one that suggests going out to the car. All too often, it is the girl." Typically, Richardson tied being chaste with respect, advising girls that boys won't respect them if they give in to petting. His advice to boys is a lot more practical, noting that getting physical might lead to going farther than intended. Instead of warning about respect, he simply admonishes boys to watch your step. In the modern day, the corsage is typically only seen on prom nights and is regarded as a charmingly hokey tradition. But back in the 50s, the man was expected to show up on a first date with flowers in hand, and the corsage was absolutely required for proms. Why? As noted in the book, From Front Porch to Back Seat, Courtship in 20th Century America, flowers and corsages were symbols of affluence and consumption in the mid-20th century. The 1950s was a consumerist, materialistic decade as the economy boomed post-war, and the rules of dating weren't immune to that. Men purchased expensive flowers to prove they could afford to do so, and women wore or carried them ostentatiously so everyone would know their date was a man of means. In fact, flowers became overt status symbols. Girls wanted orchids in part because they were so expensive, about $5 per flower, which would be more than $50 today.
For an elegant lady whose beauty is unmatched by these flowers.
Today, dating is pretty casual. A date can be anything from meeting up for coffee to something elaborate and expensive. And just about any day of the week is appropriate for a first date. In fact, sometimes a weeknight is best because it comes with work as the built-in excuse to end things early. But back in the 1950s, dating rules required you to be a little more organized. The guy was expected to ask a girl out no later than Wednesday if he expected her to be his date on Friday. In some ways, this is just basic courtesy. And even today, it's an unspoken rule that last-minute plans will always make people feel like your real plans fell through. But it was also part of a focus on communication and punctuality, plus the assumption that women would, naturally, need several days to prepare for their momentous date with the man of their dreams. But the expectation of asking early went back decades. Women on college campuses required a lot of advance notice for dates in order to build up the appearance of popularity and exclusivity. In other words, agreeing to a last-minute date made you look desperate. Believe it or not, going steady, meaning you dated one person exclusively, was something of a new concept in the 1950s. It was also a surprisingly controversial one. While you might assume that parents would be delighted that their kids were settling into a monogamous relationship, the opposite was true. People thought that teenagers should be dating around and experiencing more relationships in order to broaden their horizons. Even the Catholic Church condemned the practice of going steady, possibly because it indicated getting more comfortable with each other's bodies. In fact, going steady was actually the rebellious thing to do in some ways, and dating couples were expected to give each other small gifts to mark each other as taken. Getting pinned was part of the whole courtship ritual, and it involved literal fraternity pins or class rings. A whole industry of cheap friendship rings grew up to supply couples with tokens to give each other, and other things like bracelet charms or matching articles of clothing were used, a practice that actually continued to be popular up until the 1980s.
I didn't think you'd want to come here until we'd been pinned for a little while.
Oh, Skip. You can pin me anytime you want to.
The question of what to do on a date remains a pretty thorny one. Before you know the other person well, it can be tough to figure out what they'd enjoy doing. For that reason, a lot of early dates center on universal activities like eating dinner. But in the 50s, one of the rules was that the man made all the plans. An old instructional film called What to Do on a Date from the 1950s depicts a clueless young fellow struggling to date the girl he likes under the guidance of his friend. It's made pretty clear that one of his biggest blunders is actually asking his crush what she'd prefer to do instead of simply presenting her with a confident plan. This obviously conforms to traditional gender roles, with the man in charge so the woman can simply enjoy herself. Women were advised in the 1950s that being too self-reliant might actually ruin their relationships. They were urged to let the man take the lead in all things in order to conform to gender roles. If it seems like the 1950s were obsessed with sex, that's not entirely wrong. For one thing, after World War II, people began to get married a lot younger than they had before. In fact, In the 1950s and 1960s, people got hitched younger than just about any other time in our history. According to the book The 1950s by Nancy and William Young, most women were married by age 19. This had a ripple effect. Dating had to start earlier if people were going to find their spouses earlier. As a result, teenagers began their romantic lives far earlier than they had before, which made parents worry that they were exploring their sexuality before they were ready for it. This led directly to weird stuff like patrols organized to check that people on dates weren't making out in their cars. And this attitude also inspired some weird dating rules, like never showing physical affection in a movie theater, a popular place for such shenanigans. One of the worst rules of dating from the guidebooks of the 1950s involved how a girl should interact with their date. For Girls Only literally advises girls to fool their boyfriends by faking an interest in his hobbies. Of course, that's kind of sociopathic, but Dr. Richardson is confident that the girl in question will learn to be just as excited by her man's hobby as he is. In other words, she will slowly change in order to please the guy she's dating. This wasn't isolated advice either. A 1958 article in McCall's magazine titled 129 Ways to Get a Husband also advises ladies to learn how to clean fish or play poker in order to impress their date, whether they enjoy it or not. Of course, the idea that being yourself and expressing your actual feelings towards hobbies or date activities is against the dating rules is pretty unhealthy, and one rule that should definitely be broken.